So I have a couple of housekeeping things, as usual, to do. I want to announce that next week we're going to have On the Road to the Mayflower. Historic artist Karen Ronaldo and Kevin Dole are returning to talk about the 12 years before the Pilgrims left Holland to come to the New World. So that should be an interesting perspective. Karen is a well-known artist who has done a portrait of the first Thanksgiving that has traveled around the country and around the world because it depicts accurately all the participants in the first Thanksgiving. So I want to thank a couple people tonight. I might miss a couple, so I apologize in advance. But I want to thank Mary Jo Rubin and Molly Nelson for supplying some extra goodies for our dessert table tonight. I also want to thank our sponsors this evening, Carrie Thornburg Burse and Peter and Sue Alefarakis. So thank you very much. Our sponsors help us get quality speakers, such as the one we have this evening. So speaking of this evening, tonight we have Lenore Skomal, a career author, playwright, theater and film producer, author of 17 books, including her first published nonfiction, The Lightkeeper's Daughter, the remarkable true story of American heroine Ida Lewis, which was honored with the New York Public Library's Best Book Award of 2003 and is celebrating its 20th anniversary in continuous publication this year. As a New York City-based off-Broadway theater producer, Ms. Skomal is also the founder and director of Broadway-Bound Theater Festival, which produces and presents 20 new plays annually in Manhattan. An experienced playwright in her own right, her comedy, The X's, premiered off-Broadway in 2019 to critical acclaim and is currently licensed in regional and community theaters here and abroad. Her work has garnered the prestigious Eric Hoffer Award, a finalist spot in the Eugene O'Neill Festival, the International Book Awards for Literary Fiction, Writer's Digest 75th Writers Award First Place winner, numerous Society of Professional Journalism Awards, and winner of the New York Summer Festival's Best Play of the Season. I'm very, very, very pleased to introduce Lenore Skomal.
Thanks, Anne. And thank you all for coming this evening. And this is the book that started it all. This was my first book about Ida Lewis. It's obviously a biography. And I want to thank Anne and the board for having me here tonight. It is a professional organization. I've done hundreds of these talks, and these guys are on top of their game. So you should be really proud of their hard work. And this is a beautiful venue. It's the first time I feel like I'm speaking in a church. You know, I feel like I should, can I get an amen? So, which is a great feeling. So, and thank you all for coming out on this chilly evening in this unseasonably freezing cold spring. And being a part of this experience, because if you haven't heard of Ida Lewis, if you had heard of Ida Lewis, I know you will enjoy learning about her tonight and tonight's topic. Do you guys want to dim the lights so everybody can see the PowerPoint? As the slide says, Ida Lewis is a lighthouse keeper's daughter, one of hundreds and hundreds of lighthouse keepers' daughter back in the 1800s. What made her special? Why does she matter? Why am I even here talking about her, for that matter? Ida Lewis went from being a virtual nobody Arguably, some would say she was fairly forgettable in terms of as a young woman. She's not the most gorgeous thing on the planet. She didn't exactly have an amazing personality. She was somewhat pragmatic, very boring, not very educated. She barely made it through the 8th grade. She possessed very few of the characteristics that we would associate with celebrity, especially now in this day and age. And I'd like to ask everyone here tonight to really think about this time period we're talking about. Because what we're talking about is the 1840s to the turn of the century, when we were very limited in our forms of media. Right? Newspaper was the primary way that we learned about things. So this is important because her fame is like nothing we have ever seen today, because now obviously we have so many other modes. So how did this woman, who was notably unnotable, go from that to being the most famous woman, one of the most famous women in America, the most recognizable lighthouse keeper, and still holds the title of the most famous lighthouse keeper, and then shortly after her death, fall back into oblivion? Because a lot of people never read about her in their history books growing up, I would venture to say. I certainly didn't. Ida Lewis, it all starts here in Newport, Rhode Island. This is the house she grew up in. She was born February 24th, 1842. At the time, Newport, Rhode Island, was an island that had not really reached its zenith in the Gilded Age. It was a couple of decades from that, quite frankly. It was sort of a little bit of a cultural mecca. It was a bustling harbor still. There was a lot of farmland at the time. And Ida Lewis was born to a common laborer. Her full name was Ida Wally Zoradiah Lewis. Her mother's name was Zoradiah. She went by Ida. You can understand why. She lived on Spring Street until she was age 12. Spring Street was in town. It was sort of in the middle of town. Her father, when she reached 12 years old, her father accepted an appointment as lighthouse keeper of a newly built lighthouse called Lime Rock Light. It was just a solitary light. There was no house or anything attached to it. Lime Rock is about 200 yards from shore. And so every day, Hosea, her father, would have to row out twice a day to obviously light the light and then extinguish it. And with him, he brought his daughter. Ida was the eldest of 4 surviving children to Hosea and to Zoradiah. She was... unfortunately, her older brother, lived to be 10 and had passed away. And she sort of inherited the eldest son mantle. And she was well suited for it, quite frankly. She would what we would consider today to be a tomboy. She was very physically capable. She enjoyed the outdoors. She did a lot of activities that young boys would do, much to the chagrin of her mother. She was not ladylike in the least. And she excelled physically. She was a small child, and at full height, she was 5'4" in adulthood and only weighed 103 pounds. And she was very proud of herself because she maintained that physique throughout her entire life. She was an excellent oarswoman, and that was thanks to her father and their trips back and forth to the island. She was an excellent swimmer, which was very uncommon because swimming had not come into vogue in the early 1800s. It really didn't until the 1900s. People didn't go swimming. That was not a thing. It was not recreational. It was something you did if you were a mariner and your life depended on it. And Ida found great joy in swimming, which would aid her later in life, as we know. She also was very good at rescuing people. Her father taught her because his previous job was as a pilot in the Revenue Cutter Service, which, as some of you may know, the Revenue Cutter Service was the predecessor to the United States Coast Guard. And as a pilot, he was a hardy fellow, but he also learned how to rescue sailors. And he taught Ida how to do this, how to do it properly, and how to keep a cool head. What he didn't really have to teach Ida was courage, because she had an abundance of it. She was a very brave young woman, and she continued with that courage until the day that she passed. Because her father also suffered from ill health, he had a poor heart, that's why he retired from the cutter service. He was given this position as lighthouse keeper. So on their voyages, this is how Ida learned her craft, unknowingly, that would serve her later in life. 3 years later, the government built a house on Lime Rock, and Hosea moved himself, his wife, Ida, and his other 3 children out to the house. Unfortunately, right after the move, Hosea suffered a debilitating stroke. It rendered him helpless, basically. He couldn't really even cut his food. He could barely walk without the aid of a cane. He became an added burden to the family because not only could he not sustain his responsibilities as a lighthouse keeper, he also couldn't take care of himself as a human being. So his care fell upon his wife, and they still had 3 younger children, as Ida was 15 at this point, and she had to also take care of those kids. Plus, lighthouses typically had gardens, and they had lawns that had to be maintained, and all of this was inspected by the inspector of the Lighthouse Bureau, and they were really difficult people to please. So Ida assumed the responsibilities of the light, which is something that she loved. She loved it, and she would say later in life, the light was my child. I knew when it needed me, even when I slept. So she had this immense dedication to the light. She also had a fierce loyalty and fondness to it, which I think in so many ways identified her life and sort of fueled her to be the person that she had become. We're going to jump ahead, for a very good reason, from 1854 to 1869. In that period of time in this country, as we all know, the Civil War erupted, the Civil War ended. We're in a period, 4 years of Reconstruction, a very difficult time for this country that was really war-wounded and still kind of healing from all of that. And in Ida's life, unbeknownst to anybody, she had already conducted 4 major rescues. Nobody knew about them. She never talked about them. And unknowingly, in that period of time, that would be the last period of time that no one on this planet would know who Ida Lewis was. Because that, 1869, that is when her life changed. What we have here is a map, and I want you to take a look at it because it will explain a lot as we go forward about these rescues. Fort Adams, as you can see, is sort of on a peninsula. It was an active fort at the time. During the war, there would have been 2,400 soldiers that would have stayed there. And at this point, post-war, post-Civil War, there were about 200. It was really a recruitment depot for the 15th Infantry Regiment. So these soldiers, when they were on leave, they would want to go to town. So as you see, that's no easy task. They had to go down and around, and you can see where the lighthouse is. It kind of sits smack dab between Fort Adams and what was then Thames Street. Well, it still is, but there's no brothels there, as there were then, or pubs. And the soldiers would want to go there, let off some steam, do whatever they do, drink a lot, and then they would never want to go all the way back around. That was just a pain in the neck. And a lot of them didn't have a lot of money because nobody made a lot of money back then. So lots of times they tried to find shortcuts. And as you see, the quickest way between 2 points is across the water. And these folks didn't know anything about boating or swimming for that matter. And so on March 29th, 1869, 2 of these soldiers ventured off into town, got drunk, decided they didn't want to have to walk all the way back. So they hired a young teenage boy to take them across in his boat. A storm had set in, the boat capsized, the teenage boy drowned. The 2 men were clinging to the hull of the boat, drifting out of the harbor, when Ida's mom noticed them from the lighthouse and yelled, "Ida, you have to save these 2 guys." Her father, who was sitting in the sitting room, couldn't do anything. He said, "You're an idiot. You can't go out there and save these people. They're idiots for even being out there." She didn't listen to him, and she jumped into the boat, and she rowed out, and she rescued the both of them. And they were actually, later on when they were quoted by the newspaper, they talked about, well, we saw this woman heading towards us, and we're thinking, oh my gosh, it's never going to happen. And, you know, she proved them wrong. So that was March 29th, 1869. 4th of July, 1869, 4 months later, Independence Day was renamed Ida Lewis Day. 4 months. Well, how did that happen, right? And this is a famous painting. This hangs at the Coast Guard Academy down in Cape May, and it is a depiction of her rescuing the soldiers, somewhat embellished. And that is a 12-page story in Harper's Weekly, all about Ida Lewis, as you can see. So how did it happen? How did it happen? It's a question, I can tell you exactly how it happened in terms of what happened. because this particular rescue involved soldiers, a report had to be made. They obviously were late coming back to the fort. And so all of these reports filed through the customs house, which was sort of the main conduit in any port between what was happening there and what was going on in the federal government. The newspapers always found these reports and they'd report them. They just pop them in the newspaper. So there are always little blurbs if you look at newspapers back then, and there'll be just little happenings that happened. And there was a tiny little blurb that said, "Oh, Lightkeeper daughter Ida Lewis rescued 2 guys," and that seemed quite unusual to people that didn't know anything about Ida Lewis and weren't from that area. And so that little blurb made it to the wires. And a newspaper reporter in New York City for the Herald read it and said, "Oh my God, that's crazy." So he took a boat ride over to Newport and interviewed her. And on April 10th, an article came out all about Ida Lewis rescuing these 2 guys. And that, of course, went across the wire services. And then everybody and their brother decided in the media, we need to interview this woman. And this whole slew of articles came out. And Ida Lewis became the talk of the town. And I don't even think people in Newport actually knew who she was before this. So that's sort of technically how it happened. But how did it happen that, and we get that makes sense, but how did it happen that from that she became so famous, so well known? Well, there were 3 things, and you can see them here on the slide, that were happening at this time concurrently. This women's suffrage movement it's a complicated topic, but basically one of the factions of the women's suffrage movement was having a convention, and they decided to have it in Newport after all this happened with Ida Lewis, thinking, this is a perfect person. She's doing a man's job. She really would aid the cause. So there was that. And so the idea of women's right to vote, that was very much in the news. That was a very, very hot topic at the time. The wire services, they were developed in the 1830s, but they were really regional because, who cared, in New York what was going on, in New Hampshire. It was really just for communities. Civil War changed all that because a lot of people, it was on our soil, and people's sons were being killed every day. So that immediacy of information was very important to people. So that completely changed the wire services. So people were getting updated information almost immediately. So the wires all of a sudden became the way to find out information about the rest of the world. And so that hastened, expedited the way that story was transported across across the pond too, by the way, because they read about it in England and she became very popular over there. And the third factor was this idea of Reconstruction, the idea of post-war America, and the fact that I truly believe, and it sort of pans out because Ida Lewis really appealed to military generals, and they flocked to see her after they read about this. I think America was looking for a hero. The war really, really gutted this country. And I think the idea of a female, non-military, non-political, I think everyone just jumped on it because she was just an average, everyday person, and there was no pretense to this woman. She didn't ask for any of this. She didn't want any of it. And I think that part of it really spoke to people. And so they came out in droves. So the 4th of July, at the parade, they gave her a boat. They consigned and saved all their money up to give her this fancy boat, which she never used, by the way, because it was too cumbersome. And she had to make a speech, which she refused to do. She asked somebody else to do it for her. Everybody was wearing Ida Lewis fichu, which is a way you wear your scarf. They had Ida Lewis, pins. It was insanity. I can't even imagine if it were me. I'd be like, oh my, what's wrong with these people? So I think she thought, well, once I go back to the lighthouse, all this is going to be over. They got it out of their system, and it'll be just fine, and we can go back to life as it used to be. And she couldn't be more wrong. 1869, that summer, over 10,000 people visited Ida Lewis on her island. So do the math. That's 600 people a day. I don't even see 600 people a day. I mean, today maybe, because you're here. But So, and you're trying to do your job, and this is a grueling job, and you have people crawling up on the island uninvited. They wanted souvenirs, they wanted a piece of her, and she was naive in the beginning and gave them things. And then they started stealing things, and it became a mess because there was no way to sort of manage it. You didn't have, PR agents, none of that stuff. And she really didn't know what to do, nor did her father, who's the one that counted the 10,000, by the way. He did nothing else to do, so he sat there counting people. She had hundreds of proposals of marriage from people she never met, from mothers who said, I have a great kid. He could use a strong woman. She got gifts like silk stockings, beautiful things that she was, I don't wear this stuff. I can't, no. They wrote ballads about her. They wrote a vaudeville act, and they asked her to be in it. They would have paid her $1,700 for a 3-month tour. Her father made $500 a year. She could have easily just taken that and done it, but she's like, no. I am totally not interested in any of this. So again, she thought, well, maybe, just maybe, this will taper off, all of this crazy love. And then she made the crucial mistake, looking back on it, would have been, to hire a biographer. She said, what, I'll hire this guy, and he's going to write my story. I'll give it to people, I'll make a little money, and that's the end of it. It wasn't the end of it, because then everybody heard about the other rescues that they didn't know about that started when she was 15 years old. So all of a sudden, she now became a super heroine. And as we see, she, hang on a second, did I go back? She saved lives because she was in the newspapers every day because of this. She was on the media radar. And once you're on the media radar, at least with the local newspapers, every week there was a blurb. Ida ate oatmeal for breakfast. Ida, not unlike today with Instagram and all these things. It's like, look what I did. It's like, nobody cares. If there had been paparazzi at the time, Ida Lewis would have been Princess Di. She was not left alone. The poor woman was hounded. And so like this article here that you see, it's, these types of things. And these are pictures of Ida. Obviously, she's getting a little older. So Ida Lewis continued on. Her father maintained his position as keeper of the light, even though he was technically not able to do the job. He passed away in 1872. That left the government, and this happened quite frequently. The government decided that they would leave everything as it was, that Zoradiah would sign the logs, even though Ida Lewis was keeping all the logs, and they would continue to pay her, even though Hosea was technically still the lighthouse keeper. This was worrisome to Ida, because they were doing it because they figured this poor woman, she has no real career, and she's got these kids, and we're just going to keep doing this until she dies. Well, what would happen when Zoradiah died? Ida was very concerned about this. Plus, she was also miffed because here she had all of this fame, had all these people banging down her door, had all this publicity, yet she did not have the title. And the newspapers called her the lighthouse keeper, and she wasn't. She also was getting older. She was in her 30s. Now, that's not old by our standard, but the average lifespan for women back then was 50. How long could she continue to haul drunk grown men, out of the water? How many more rescues could she do? How long could she keep up taking care of the light or getting any type of fame for herself? Without the official appointment, she had no money, no salary, no home, nothing. And she was married briefly, but she was not married then. And without a husband, this would have left her destitute. There weren't pensions back then. So she was in a pickle, and she was very, very concerned about this. She did have a tendency to fret quite a bit. And the newspapers brought it up every chance they got. What's going to happen to Ida Lewis? She's not appointed, blah, blah, blah. So all of this sort of fed this anxiety and the stress that she was going through. Fortunately, Ida had made a lot of very powerful friends. As I said, all of these generals, including, Ulysses S. Grant, who was president at the time, he came to see her. General Sherman came to see her. And this fellow right here, who's Ambrose Burnside, was a U.S. senator at the time. He was a general in the Army. He made sideburns famous, as you probably remember. And he was shortly the governor of Rhode Island, and then he became a congressman. His wife was a huge fan of Ida Lewis. They lived in Providence, and so she said, you know, Ida Lewis has not been appointed, honey. And he said, okay. He goes, that's terrible, after everything she's done for this country and all of this. So he intervened, and then she was appointed, and at the age of 86 years old. And that was thanks to him. And oddly and sadly, he passed away right after that. So it's important to note, though, here that Ida, during a lot of the rescues, and I didn't talk about a lot of them just because of the time constraint, but suffice it to say that she risked her life. She risked her life for several of them. I mean, she could have died because all of them happened in the dead of winter, first of all. The majority of them were with drunk soldiers who couldn't swim. I don't know why they didn't just add that as like a course or something. And it would be the dead, and she was not in the best of health. She did suffer with a bout of diphtheria that kept recurring, and that literally you can choke to death with that. It's just it's an infection of the membrane, and it would take her months to recover, and it was really sad because I think that over time that sort of took its toll on her overall health. But I do want to talk about her most famous rescue, because this is the one that garnered her what we consider the Civilian Congressional Medal of Honor. She was the first woman to ever receive this honor. And it was because of this rescue that, do we have this? Hang on a second. There it is. February 4th, 1881. Ida would have been just 39 years old. And February 4th, of course, freezing cold, dead of winter. And back then, the harbor would freeze over, but not fully, especially towards the end where it got the depths changed. And so if you remember the map that we looked at of where Fort Adams was, these fellows decided after a night of drinking that they were going to walk across back to Fort, and they'd get there in time. So Ida was by the fire. She had just recovered from a really bad cold, and she was sitting by the fire, and her mother once again yelled and said, Ida, 2 men have fallen through the ice. And she said, okay. So she got up and she ran out. She didn't have shoes on. She didn't put a coat on. She grabbed a clothesline, and she ran out, and her mother said to her brother, her younger brother, you need to follow her. She's going to need you. And she got out to where these 2 fellows had fallen in, and they were frantic. They couldn't swim. She was very concerned about hypothermia for herself, her brother, and of course them. And she threw the rope to them and instructed them, just one at a time. She'd wrapped the rope around her waist, and they both grabbed the rope, and in she went. Now, so we can picture this, right? And so cool-headed, this woman, she never broke a sweat. She was able to manage herself out of the water. Her brother by then had arrived. And the reason I know all of this in great detail is because she was deposed. There was a deposition, and that's how she got the medal. So they talked to her family, they talked to her, and the soldiers corroborated. She calmed them down. Her brother anchored the rope. He wrapped it around his waist. She had it around hers. They got the first guy out, dragged him out, and then got the second one out. They were almost dead. And they got them back to the house, gave them hot toddy, and one thing led to another, and got them back to the fort the next day. So this was a really big deal, and they had a formal ceremony at the customs house, and Ida, that's what the medal looked like. And it was her prized possession till the day she died, because it was obviously got a lot of attention because she was the first woman to actually ever receive such a prestigious honor. As we call it Ida's twilight, throughout the course of her life, Ida's flame never extinguished. She was always in the newspapers in some form or another. Her acts of bravery continued. She had many rescues. As she got older, people would pretend to fall in the water and say, rescue me, and stuff like that. But the world around her was changing. Electricity had been introduced. There was a lot of discussion about moving away from the way the lighthouses worked as navigational aids. A lot of lighthouses were being electrified. She was very, very concerned about that. Her mother passed away. A sister and her brother passed away. So she lived on the island alone with her brother Rudolph, who was a part-time fisherman. But as she got older, and in the early 1900s especially, the Lighthouse Bureau changed. There was a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of the forms had changed that you had to fill out, and she was not accustomed to that. So she started to get cited in her file for, oh, she did this, she did that, and a lot of these younger clerks did not respect her. They didn't respect what she had done. They just wanted her to go away. And all of these citations really weighed heavily on her. Her brother talked about it after she had passed away. So there was that, and then there was a rumor that they were going to abolish the lighthouse altogether. And she was like, that just did her in, and she was extremely concerned about that. In 1910, Putnam Magazine wrote that article. They published that article called The Half-Forgotten Heroine. It was a very long piece that sort of recapped her life. And in it was, I thought, essentially something extremely like the missing piece to the puzzle about why was Ida Lewis so wed to being a lighthouse keeper. That's a hard job, and it is a thankless job, and it's boring. So I never really could relate to that until I read this article, and then I did a little more research, and I realized Ida Lewis, the light defined Ida Lewis's life. It gave her routine, and as a Yankee, she loved her routine. And it gave her a sense of, okay, I have to be here, I have to do this, I know how to do this, da-da-da. So a lot of it was very comfortable for her. But she had this sort of fierce pride and loyalty to the light, she's calling it her child and all of this. And even her brother said, the only way Ida wants to leave this island is in a coffin. And she had said, and I quote here, there are hundreds of boats going in and out of this harbor, and it's part of my happiness to know that they're depending on me to guide them home safely. And I truly believe that every time she lit that light and when she extinguished it, she thought of thousands of faceless mariners who were coming in and out and relied on that for safety. And that, and so the whole rescuing people and all of that, that was a footnote to who she believed she was and what really motivated her and what really kept her so dedicated to that what some people just consider a job. So when she passed away, which was October 24th, 1911, about a year after that article came out, she had had a massive stroke, and it left her in a coma. The War Department ordered artillery practice to be ceased at the forts so as not to disturb her. And she died the morning of October 24th. Her body was laid in state, and her casket was at the Methodist Church on Thames Street. 7,500 people passed by her casket. They hung the flags at half-mast, so she was treated like a military hero. And I think she would actually love that. It's about 10 years after that, and it started right after her death, but it took about 10 years. There was a groundswell of support to try to change the name of the lighthouse to the Ida Lewis Lighthouse. And it went through, and it is the only lighthouse that has been named for a person, ever. They're usually named for longitude, latitude, or like shipwrecks, things like that. So, and now it's the Ida Lewis Yacht Club, because they purchased it in 1927, but they kept Ida Lewis, so we're happy about that. So today, the United States Coast Guard has a cutter that's named after her. It takes care of 348 navigational aids and does search and rescue. So exponentially, she's saving way more people. She also has a street named after her in Arlington Cemetery. And in Cape May, which is the training center for the Coast Guard, they have a beautiful dedication to her when you walk into their main reception hall. They really look at her as their sort of patron saint. They absolutely love her. And in fact, it was the young men and women who served on that cutter 20 years ago when the book came out, and they raised the money to fix her stone, because her stone was just this tiny thing that no one even noticed, and you saw a picture of it earlier, but it has like the chains around it, and it's just right there. It's massive. And they were the ones that did that, because they were like, she deserves so much more in death than what we've given her. So to that end, on your, and I'll take questions in just 1 second. Ida Lewis, my book, was optioned by a Hollywood producer and director, and he is actually joining me for the second half of this tour in July. And his name is Nico Reno, and I put flyers on your seat. Asked my husband to put flyers on your seat because we started up an Ida Lewis newsletter because Nico, I think, is more in love with her than I am, even though I know more about her life than I know about my own. So he really has been dedicated to, and he wants to do a really big job. He wants to do a $100 million budget film on Ida Lewis. He wants it to be a period film, much like Little Women, but it has to be shot on the water, a lot of it, obviously. It's how she rescued people, which is extremely pricey. And it's also something that Hollywood producers are not happy about. They're like, oh no, let's all do CGI, and we don't want to do any of that. And he doesn't want that. So towards that end, like I said, I really started this tour because I wanted to sort of get the enthusiasm going for Ida Lewis again. I mean, the book keeps selling, which is wonderful, and that tells me one thing, not like I'm an amazing author, but her life means something. And I think in this world of TikTok and all these silly things and people who become famous just because, I don't know, they have weird butts or something, and they, I don't know, they eat cinnamon. I'm not really sure. And you have a bona fide heroine who actually, at the core of her life was a brave soul. There's something super appealing about that to me. And the fact that we can actually show this as an example to especially young women, teenagers, and say, this does happen. So the flyer that I left has, if you want to sign up for our newsletter and just stay in tune with what we're doing, we're going full steam ahead to get funding for that film. And we also have there's a scan code on there if you're interested in our fundraiser. And you can just, use your phone to scan it or, email me or whatever. But our goal is to bring Ida back to the national conscience. And have people remember who she was and why she was so important. And I feel really happy about the fact that that book was even published originally, just as an aside, because when I started the research, there was so little on her. And everybody in Newport, and obviously I did all the research there at the Historical Society, but the common belief was that Ida was illiterate. And there was all this crazy stuff. And I started to think maybe Ida's like Paul Bunyan. Maybe she never existed, They threw her name around, but she was a chapter in a couple of books. And there was this repeated chapter over and over again. And then once I started the deep dive, what I realized is that she was shy. She didn't keep a journal. Like, that would have never occurred to her. But there's such a rich depth of history there that was never mined. And so after the book came out, then the Historical Society put together an exhibit, and then it was like, this is your hometown daughter. I mean, this is your favorite son right here. She's hugely famous. A lot of towns don't have that. So I'm sure Barnstable does. But, Newport, I'm like, lay claim to her. Forget the mansions. This is an important thing. So after that, I felt like things started to, then all of a sudden there were tours, and let's take the boat out and look at the Ida Lewis. And then they also took the lighthouse, the main room of it, and they converted it back to what it looked like when Ida was living there. So the hearth is there and some other things. So I was super happy that it was like, okay, this book made a tiny little wrinkle in history and maybe brought her back to some prominence. But if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. And I hope you, enjoyed learning about her life, because she's a fascinating human being. Thank you. Yes. Because my sister went to Salve Regina. My younger sister went to Salve Regina, and we'd go to homecoming things, and then I'd hear about Ida Lewis, and I was like, who is this? And that's what started me on this little mission. And I realized, there's no definitive biography on this woman. So yeah, that's what the impetus was, quite frankly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, when she did those, she also had, because I researched the dresses back then. Now, not only did she have the whole, she was hemmed in. She also had 10 yards of fabric. That's the amount of yards. And if you know anything about sewing, that's a lot of freaking fabric to have in a skirt, And then when wool gets wet, try swimming in that in icy water, and not just giving up and saying, please, God, take me now. Yeah. I'm glad you asked, because that's a fascinating story. So when she became famous, 1869, right, she was already engaged. She'd been engaged for 3 years. So let's think about that. Who gets engaged at 3? She was already a spinster by by definition back then. She was 27. So my feeling was always like, maybe she didn't really want to get married, because back then you had to move in with your husband. It wasn't like they moved in with you. So she was engaged to this guy who was he was a pilot. He was a yachtsman, so he was a for-hire pilot, and he lived in Black Rock, Bridgeport, Connecticut, which was a seaport, and he would be hired out, and he would take the boats across to Newport, and that's how I think they met. I don't really know how they met. But after she became famous, she married him, like immediately. So I was like, okay. So she's thinking, I'll get out of the limelight and all of this. Well, she had to move to Black Rock. And all the research I found is there's nothing in the newspapers about her during those 2 years. She was with him for 2 years. Her father died in 72. Then we see her back in Lime Rock. That's when she appears back, which would make sense because her father died. She said when she got married, I will respect my marriage. I'll never get divorced. I'll always have my husband's last name, blah, blah, blah. Well, that lasted about 2 years. She dumped his last name. His name was William Hurd Wilson. And so she was Ida Lewis Wilson. And then it was like, you know what? Get rid of the Wilson. That's fine. So I don't know they never divorced. I don't know what happened. I mean, he was a sailor. He may have been his history itself, because we did a little bit of a deep dive, Nico and myself, his history was a little spotty. After he was the sailor, then he got like sort of odd jobs in Bridgeport. He was a night watchman, and he did some things. I'm like, maybe he had a drinking problem or something. And then he died in a soldiers and sailors home on Long Island about 11 years after she passed away. But he was never mentioned after the marriage. The papers didn't do any follow-up or anything, and she would not talk about it. So it's this big question mark, that I'll figure it out. Yes, Deb?
Did she have to stop rescue as she got older, or did she continue rescuing all the way up to the point?
She continued rescuing. And I think maybe the fort got smarter, because that was the last big one. But she did, there's some stories about it, some of her friends were coming out, because the other weird thing was that she was sort of a tourist attraction. I mean, all of the Astors, the Vanderbilts, when they came and built their mansions and all of that, and they'd come to visit her, and she was never invited to a tea party or anything at their houses, but she did become friends with Elsie Vanderbilt, who was like the great-granddaughter of the big guy, and because their mansion was directly across from, and it's now the New York Yacht Club. But she lived there. And so she would come over and they visited. And one time she was coming over with some friends, and one of the friends fell in. I'm like, it's 200 yards. What's the problem here? And it's like, oh, let's stand. So she went down, and then Ida, zipped out and got her back into the boat pretty quickly. So, I'm sure at that point, Ida was like, really? This isn't hard, kids. Yeah.
Were there actual interviews that were written to dialogue for her, along with being written about her?
What do you mean? I'm sorry.
Did they have a dialogue with her so you could see he said and she said, and
There's
get a sense of what she was all about?
There's not a lot of that, but there's one. The suffragettes, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, went to see her and tried to convince her, you need to join the movement, sister. And she was like, you need to leave. So she said, I would rather have to rescue another drunken soldier than to see you again. So she was not interested at all, which I wonder if that bit her in the butt later on. But they had a newspaper, it was like a periodical, called The Revolution. And that exact trip was written about, and it's written about in detail. So there is an exchange in that, which is really interesting. And that is classic Yankee. She's like, yep, no, you're leaving? So, no real conversation at all. It's like, okay, let's move it along, ladies. I got laundry to do. Yeah.
Personal or family sources of information did you find that you have available to you?
You mean like from her family, or?
Like just immediate from her or from her family? What sources did you find or have available to you from that?
None. There was none. But interestingly enough, and believe me, I tried, but there was nothing there. And honestly, because of the way, when she left the lighthouse, when her body left the lighthouse, and her brother packed all her things up, he left everything, and it was her request, and it was all typed out because I found the list, left everything in her possession to the Newport Historical Society, which had just been founded back then. So they, at the time, just took all of it. And, 90% of it, is not there. I mean, we don't know what happened to it. They don't know because the folks that are there now were not around 100 years ago. So, and I thought with that there might have been something, whatever, a diary, letters, something that she would have kept. All of her brothers, her sisters and her brothers never had children. She never had a kid, obviously. She had a stepbrother from her father's first marriage, and there were 2 daughters from that fellow. And I tried to find them, but I don't, they got married. You don't know what happens to people's last names. But at my last talk, which was in Newport, a fellow came up to me and he said, I'm related to Ida Lewis. And I said, how? And he said, Zoradiah, the mother, was a Wiley. That's her maiden name. It was through that. So he was descended from that side. But then I asked him the same thing. Do you have anything? Did anything sort of get filtered down? He's like, I don't have anything. So I'm like, all right. You kind of think it's in someone's attic somewhere, So yeah. I'm not a lighthouse expert, but I play one on TV. No, I just know that and I'll tell you, if anybody is, and there are people who this is their life, they love to talk about this stuff. It's just very tedious because cleaning the light itself is a process. It's multiple steps, and it takes certain types of brushes and certain types of cleaners. You can't have fingerprints, blah, blah, blah. This lens was a very small lens. It's the smallest of all the Fresnel lenses that was in the Ida Lewis, now the Yacht Club. They actually have moved it out, but it's a tiny lens, so it wouldn't have been so arduous, but they used kerosene to heat the thing. And in fact, fun fact, when Ida was going through one of her diphtheria bouts, she actually took 2 tablespoons of kerosene, thinking it would clear her up. Then when they found her 3 days later on the floor, they're like, that's such a good idea. A lot of the work with the lighthouses, though, came from maintaining the property and maintaining the actual house. Lighthouse keepers, the inspectors, they were awful. They came in with the white gloves and this type of thing, and you'd be cited if there was dust on anything, and if the lawn wasn't taken care of, and your garden wasn't perfect, and all of that. That was 90% of it was keeping the whole place up, and that's a lot to try to maintain a property like that. Electricity basically would mean you don't have to have somebody there all the time. She had to be there because if the light went out, and her bedroom was directly across from what would have been the lantern room. And she kept the door open, and she kind of always had one eye out for it. Because if it went out, then it would be like, oh, there's a storm coming and maybe it had blown out or something. But I'm sorry I can't answer your question more specifically, but I do know that from everything that I've read, it was a super tedious job. I would have never done it. Everyone would be drowning if I did it. Like, oh, whatever, you're fine. Yes, sir. Yeah, they had to keep logs.
So did you ever have a chance to read any of her entries or whether that illuminates anything about who she was?
I did. I read them because they're kept in Washington in the archives. And I went down there. We took a trip down there, and that's when I did all the weather research to find out what was going on in Newport, that the harbor was freezing over and all that. So it was an incredibly harsh couple of winters during that time period. But I did read through it. There's nothing in it other than it's supplies. It's like, I need a gallon of this, I need this, I need this. We went through this today. There's no sort of little joke it was like strictly by the book, mister. So I really, and so a lot of what I have sort of extrapolated has come from the newspaper articles and the way that she answered questions, for instance. And then it was like looking at what was happening at the time and the way she had been approached by people was hard. I was like, that's why she made this decision. That's why she made that decision. It started to fall into place where I got an idea about her personality. And so some of it, and then I think later on as we've done more research, I did this book before the internet was a thing, by the way. It just was coming out. So this was all research done, in the library, walking through boxes and stuff like that. So that's why I know it's pretty accurate, because I didn't just pick stuff off the internet and say, oh yeah, that's what happened. I wanted to make sure it was bona fide, But I'm not a historian, so I can't really say that everything was 100%. But there's more to this story, and I'm curious, especially about the marriage, and also about those years where she was under all that stress. That's a period of time that they don't write much about, because she was in the newspapers, but not nearly as much. And I was just always curious, because that's when her female relationships with Elsie Vanderbilt, that's when those things started to happen. And I had a sense that she was coming into her own as a human being. She was older, she could entertain people, she had people over. She was always temperate, though. She never drank. no surprise there. And she was a devout Christian. She was a Methodist, but she was always reading the Bible. And so there's more aspects to her I would love to add, because I want to do another version of the book when the movie comes out and add some of the new research that I found and just embellish her life a little bit more. Yes, ma'am. She is going to have to talk, isn't she? Yeah, well, he wrote the script, and he did make a bunch of things up. It's an interesting movie, kind of little, he takes some liberty with it, but we give her a voice in it, and it's very much like we were talking about tonight. It's, pragmatic, New England, that type of thing. The only one that I actually know that was in the paper was this Elsie Vanderbilt, so I'd have to actually look to see if she had any writings and where that's all kept. That's a really good point, actually. I thank you.
When they did those logs, when she had those logs, did she ever mention other people that were there?
No, it was strictly supplies. It was strictly, I painted the shed today. No, it wasn't like, let me chat about, she was not that person.
She was well known. The newspapers might have said something if there was a special event around.
Yeah, I read all of them. Ad nauseum. They say a lot of things, but some of it is all, come on, newspapers. Back then, there was a lot of social news. That was the thing, like, Miss Smith and her sheep. There were things that were just little blurbs. And I was always in the little blurb part. But you had to research it and realize some of this stuff was just fabricated, just to, entertainment. Not unlike today, Oh, if there's nothing else, yes, ma'am. That's right.
So in her case, where did her belongings go? Who got them? Or, what happened when you're married? You're held you and the property.
Yeah, well, not anymore, hopefully, but yeah. When she died, her brother had to move out. They offered him the job, and he said, no way. So he moved out, and he moved in with family friends, and he had her belongings, and then he, at her behest, gave it all to the Newport Historical Society. I'm talking about the medals and all of that, not like her clothing. And honestly, to that note, the fellow there was one other lighthouse keeper after her. He was there for the duration, and then they shut the lighthouse down. But he found, when he moved in, her corset was thrown down the stairs into the basement. So I said, that was probably on purpose, damn thing. So, but she wore one. She wore one, God bless her. Yeah. I think she probably became interested in him later on. She was apolitical. And I think she was also Christian. And I think a lot of that was like, honor your father, honor your mother, this